Hello everyone, I am Attila and I would like to welcome you all in this video, which is basically a review of a Warhammer 40k book, The Nexus and Other Stories. I have only average English knowledge, but I try my best. Sorry if I am grammatically and verbally not correct. Hopefully this video will be a precursor to longer series in which I would like to talk about only such books which take place in the Warhammer 40k universe, and I would like to introduce the listeners to this world. The Nexus and Other Stories is a great book for this, and I want to give you all my thoughts and impressions about it, and I will even tell some spoiler, although I will mention it there first. Because of the speciality of this publication, I will also talk about the world of Warhammer 40k itself in a few sentences. It's going to be a long broadcast, I think, so if you are doing something, feel free to start it up, because it will be a good background noise. The video is intended to be entertaining, informative and relaxing, so let's get started. As I mentioned, the book is an introduction to the world of Warhammer 40k. This intention marked with the Start Here logo on the cover. So it's basically aimed to the beginners, but it's also a great read for those who are fan of the universe for a long time. They will find many famous characters and subtle references in the novels. Suffice it to say that we will meet Inquisitor Eisenhorn in one short story, or Fabius Bile in another, and Commander Farsight also appears among the others, and I could go on. First of all, I would like to talk about the structure of the book, which I think is the big advantage of the publication. This book is an anthology, which means that it consists of a number of separate, unrelated stories, each of which is shorter or longer. The only thing they are in common that they are all take place in the world of Warhammer 40k. This structure already makes the book much more reader-friendly. Because of the short length of the individual stories, there are no or far fewer so-called boring descriptions or dialogues. There are no slow storytelling. Instead of it, the action dominates, which is a very expected thing in the war-centric world of the Warhammer. So, most of the time, you find yourself in the middle of the action very quickly. At the beginning of each stories, there is a small teaser that indicates which Warhammer 40k faction will be the protagonist of the story, and in one or two sentences, it roughly describes the main flow of the story. For example, before the first story, we could read the followings. The Ultramarines must fight with endless alien hordes to survive, while a mysterious and strange shroud descends on the planet, or in the second story's introduction, the Space Wolf protagonist seeks a glorious and dignified death to join his comrades in the afterlife. These little preludes are great teasers and help the reader to get into the background of the story, because they are informed about the main faction and some of the details of the story. There are 16 writings in total, where each main character representing a different organization, group or race, meaning that we will be reading stories about 16 Warhammer 40k factions. These factions are on the good side, or rather, I would say on the side of humanity, the Space Marines, including the Ultramarines, the Space Wolves, the Dark Angels, the Blood Angels, and the Death Watch, and in addition the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Fleet, the Inquisition, the Sister of Battle, and Adeptus Mechanicus and the Adeptus Custodes. Then there are the alien races, the Orcs, the Tau, the Eldars, and the Necrons, as well as the Chaos, who is the absolute antagonist, also represent itself in a short story. At the end of each story, we get 2 more book recommendations with a cover image to help us to find more similar books if we liked the particular faction in the story. This basic content structure is intended to give us broad insight as possible into the Warhammer 40k universe considering its complexity. The Warhammer 40k is such a science fiction world that includes hundreds of books, the world's most famous strategy figure game, dozens of computer games, dozens of role-playing games, and other board games. I think this universe is the largest in scope and one of the most well-designed. Before we get into the specific stories, I should point out that I read the first half of the book much earlier, so my knowledge about the details may not be accurate in everything, but I try not to be wrong. On the other hand, I would like to tell those who haven't yet read any Warhammer book that the main line of Warhammer basically belongs to the category of light literature, in which militarism, combat, and action play the central role, so you should not expect complex inner psychological processes, existential thoughts, questions, and answers. This world is set into the 40th millennium of humanity, or more precisely, the 41st millennium, and this universe is a very powerful dystopia. It's a dark and gloomy world where humanity has the largest empire, but it's still struggling to survive. After this small introduction, let's talk about the short stories. The first is the Nexus, which is also the title short story of the volume. The protagonists are the Space Marines, mankind's genetically engineered super soldiers who fight for the human empire with implants, extra organs, full body battle armors, incredible courage, and unquestioning loyalty. For this strange empire, which is best described by one of the characters in this short story as the Imperium might be protecting them at the moment, but no one ever imagined it was soft. Even when it was holding back the blade above your head, it was still the iron fist. Obey or be crushed. Quote ended. So the Empire of Man, which we call Imperium, it's a ruthless, religiously based dictatorship that is quite dysfunctional and almost nightmarishly bureaucratic. The Space Marines serve this empire. They form into individual autonomous orders, which we call chapters. In this, they are similar to the medieval Knight Orders. This short story is about the Ultramarine chapter. One of the main characters of the novel is Alexius, who stands out among the Space Marines. He is the embodiment of absolute good virtues. By the way, he is on the cover of the book if you buy the first version, not the second one, which portrays an orbital bombardment. Alexius is an excellent soldier and an excellent leader. Brave, determined, resolute, honest, humble, strong, and capable. On the planet Cassata, he must fight with the Necrons, an ancient alien race which looks most like the machines in the Terminator movies. They are soulless, ruthless, merciless towards all living things. According to their backstory, they are stuck somewhere on the borderline between real life and death. There is a reason for that, but I won't go into that subject here. They are similar to Terminators not only because of their appearance, but also because of their regenerative abilities. If a Necron doesn't immediately die of its wounds, its body will repair itself, for example, by ejecting bullets. Alexius starts out as a sergeant at the beginning of the story, but soon he is given the task of leading all Ultramarine units on the planet. The previous lieutenant died in battle, and he specifically named Alexius as his successor, even though he wasn't the senior sergeant in line. The other protagonist is Gnaeus, who is some kind of servant, but according to my memory, his rank is not explicitly stated. His character with much less combat value, but his heart is in the right place. The short story is set in the final days of the siege of Cassotea. The only fortress left in the imperial hands is the one in the capital city of the planet. They are running out of ammunition, no reinforcements, and airstrikes are limited because of the Necrons are using force shields and the strange device that seems to affect the soul and the inner being of the humans, and in fact this device is slowly putting the inhabitants of the planet into a catatonic state. The Necrons are overwhelmingly outnumbered. The defenders, the Imperium, have been able to hold out only because the Space Marines and the enemy is preparing for the final siege of the last stronghold. According to the forecast, such a big Necron troop approaching to the stronghold that even the Space Marines won't able to hold on. Many people have declared that there are no really good guys in the Warhammer universe, and it's a valid argumentation. The Empire definitely can be considered as good in absolute sense because it's a brutally harsh, oppressive, and cruel dictatorship. The Warhammer universe itself seems to be characterized by a kind of despondency and hopelessness. Some people think that the Space Marines are also not good because they are basically uninteresting and unemotional warriors who just do their job, i.e., fighting, but for example, don't care about civilians. I don't want to go deeper into this subject, but in this writing, we find examples for the opposite of these opinions, at least in the persons of Alexius, who utters such monologues like honor doesn't bow before circumstances, or the Space Marines are invincible ideals of virtue, and as they have honored us with their service, so we must honor them in their death. The latter is said in a hospital in relation to the attitude towards the patients. So, returning to the story, Alexius finds himself in a desperate situation, knowing that he is unable to defend the fortress. It will fall sooner or later, and as a result of it, the refugees within its walls will die. He has less than 100 Space Marines left by this time, but he hatches a desperate plan. According to this plan, he breaks out from the fortress with his forces and destroys the Necron's central base. Leaving behind only 4 Space Marines, Alexius and his men set off and break out. We can follow the siege of the fortress from the view of Gnaeus, who, as I mentioned earlier, has much lesser combat value. All refugees at the stronghold are armed and desperately preparing for the siege. They have much to fear because ordinary people can barely compete face to face with the Necrons. The description of the siege of the fortress is pretty well done. You can almost feel the fear and desperation. Gnaeus are waiting at the main gate for the Necrons who want to break into the stronghold. They don't have intervened in the fighting until their machine guns on the front wall can hold off the enemy, but suddenly the guns go silent because they run out of ammunition, and then the Necron infantry burst into the fort. In addition, some of their units with teleport or with other methods get inside the stronghold. Soon, the rear defense lines will be fighting for their lives despite the front lines haven't been full yet. It's not difficult to imagine how the people who are already in fear of death will be overcome by despair. In this situation, Gnaeus decides to help the almost completely defenseless remaining civilians in the fortress to escape to the transports. Their evacuation is being obstructed because for some reason Gnaeus leave the first line of the defense, which is already on the edge of collapse, and head for the refugees inside the fort. The novel culminates in the heroic stand of the two protagonists. On the one hand, Alexius's brutal battle against the overwhelming force at the Necron base, and on the other Geneus's journey. From here, a powerful spoiler ensues, so if you don't want to hear that, scroll forward approximately 2 minutes in the video. At one point in Alexius's battle, he realizes they cannot win. Not only they won't survive, but they won't even succeed in destroying their main target, a Necron tower which standing out from the ground. So Alexius decides to call a limited orbital bombardment and exterminatus for their position. However, at the moment, even this is not feasible, because there is a strong defensive shield which protecting this area, which only will disappear for a while if the Necron commander at the battlefield is destroyed. Alexius therefore launches a final assault on the commander and successfully defeats the Necron. Also, he is brought down in the attack after he rises in the last moment of his life, which I believe is the climax of the novel. He looks out over the battlefield, the approaching enemy, the fallen brothers, and finally, with his remaining strength, he proudly raises his sword above his head, and the star has descended from the sky to meet him. This is a fine description of the limited exterminatus rocket being fired to the planet to Alexius's location. Gneus, the other protagonist, follows a similar path. With difficulty, he manages to reach a room full of refugees and leads a group of them to the boarding zone. There, he faces with the fact that the Necrons have already got in with a large group, and there's no one else in the area with any weapon except him. Gneus decides to save as many civilians as he can and tries to get the attention of the leader of the Necron team. To do this, he knows that he must appear to the enemy as a worthwhile, dangerous, relevant target, i.e., he must show strength. He succeeds in doing so at the cost of shooting a few Necrons, and the leader decides that Gneus is worth a duel. They begin the fight. During the duel, Gneus' luck runs out. The Necron leader takes him down easily and brutally, cutting off both his arms. Gneus, with his eyes closed, is waiting for the final blow, which just won't come. When he finally opens his eyes, he sees fighter planes and the arrival of another Space Marine chapter, and that's pretty much the end of the story. Spoiler is over. I consider Nexus to be a very good piece of writing in its category. Perhaps the best piece of short story in the volume, if the measure is how much we can harmonize with the characters. Alexius is an absolutely noble warrior, the epitome of military virtue, and Gneus is a fallible, very human, and likably character. Although it's obvious that the main protagonist of the novel is formally Alexius, it has to be said that preferably Gneus is a greater hero because he has to reach high standard with little fight potential. He lacks great fighting skills and has to face serious fears. This cannot be said about Alexius, who is a fearless, trained warrior, and if someone would like to be brave and act bravely, he or she must necessarily feel fear. In the path of courage, there is fear. In fact, the real fear only exists in the path of courage. Gneus shows greater progress and leaps higher levels. In fact, he essentially sacrificed himself completely because his escape didn't depend on him. That's all I could say about Nexus, and now go for the second story. The second story's title is Kraken, and its protagonist is a space wolf named Quara. His chapter is not unlike the Ultramarines described before. The Ultramarines are very disciplined in their observance of the rules and regulations that apply to the Space Marines, while the Space Wolf is less so. Basically, in a very simplified interpretation, they are a bit like space Vikings. They wear mostly wolf's bones and fur, they like hand to hand combat and bravery, usually have long hair and beards. This short story is a kind of redemption story. It's only some kind of because the main character has not actually committed a real crime from which he needs to be cleansed. Quara's sin is that he is the sole survivor of his team, which he cannot accept or come to terms with, despite the fact that he was not a coward in the battle in which his comrades died. He fought bravery in that tragical battle. According to the Spacewell philosophy, despite all of this, he tries to atone for what happened by seeking a glorious hunt, a worthy opponent to defeat or be defeated by. He has been on this lonely quest for some time when he arrives on the planet Lysis. This story is unique in that it has a little philosophical thread. We can gain an insight, but not too deeply, into Quara's spiritual world and emotions that play out in it. The story itself moves on three planes, alternately in the past and in the present. One of them takes place before Quara becomes a space wolf, where he and his people are hunting at the sea on Fenris, the home planet of the space wolves. The second plane looks at the loss of Quara's space wolf team, and the third plane takes place in the present on Lysis. The problem in Lysis is that something is completely destroying the seaweed processing facilities and their workers one by one. The local authorities can't find the reason for this, and they can't uncover any clues that could lead them to the attackers. To relive the situation, the lonely space wolf Kara arrives, who finds this incident worthy of his vow for the great hunt, so he sets out to investigate the problem. The locals are quite surprised about Quara because this space marine doesn't look like the noble, glorious, and shining armor wearing space marines of the recordings. Quara looks a little bit battered. It should be noted that in the Warhammer universe, space marines are considered extremely rare. Most people never see one in real life, only in pictures. On Lysis, it's soon discovered that a race called the Tyranids have appeared on the planet, and Quara must engage them. The Tyranids are roughly similar to the Xenomorphs in the Alien movies or the Zergs in the StarCraft. They are full with teeth, tentacles, and claws. They don't have much autonomy, not even separate consciousness, except for their highest level specimen. Their goal is to absorb and assimilate all the bioorganisms on a given planet, turning them into tyrannids, and then slowly moving onto another planet and eventually another galaxy. So, Ulysses Quara has to deal with a large group of these creatures and their main leader. I don't want to tell you more about this novel, so let's move on the third story. The third short story is called Redeemer. This story is much shorter than the previous ones. It's about a third Space Marine chapter, The Blood Angels. The plot itself is not very exciting, but there are some atmospheric descriptions in the novella that save the overall picture. For example, the planet itself, where Ashtorath, the main character, arrives. This planet is under a serious demonic influence, and they are practically cut off from the outside universe. The old lady who receives Ashtorath tells us that things started to go wrong when he was a small child. At first, some of the inhabitants of the planet had harmless dreams of little white, doll like creatures with big eyes and sharp teeth. Then these creatures began to appear in the dreams of all the inhabitants. Later, they began to see them in real life. At first, they were just out of the corner of their eye in shadowy places, and when they looked at, they disappeared. Then they stopped disappearing, and the first murders started. Now, the population lives in constant fear and struggle because these creatures have invaded the planet. The distress call was made by the last astropath 70 or 80 years ago, and only recently have just 4 space marines arrived to take on the enemy. But they proved to be enough and effectively exterminated these creatures until the event that brought Astorath here. Astorath is the chief chaplain of the Blood Angels. Chaplains feel a special need for the Space Marines. There is also a chaplain in the first novel, by the way. They are the spiritual leaders, counselors, encouragers, exhorters, and disciplinarians of the Space Marines. They keep an eye on morale, on principles. I think I read somewhere that they can even execute a Space Marine if they judge it the right thing. So Astorath is a Space Marine with that vocation, and he is a High Chaplain, which rank is more special in the Blood Angels chapter than in the others. Astorath has to hunt down the Blood Angels who are consumed by the Black Rage. It's a condition which is unique among the Space Marines, and only the Blood Angels chapter suffers from it. Without going into too much detail, because then I would have to go into other larger scale stuff, it's such a stadium where the person goes into a state of consciousness similar to madness. They don't perceive reality correctly. They attack everyone around them, whether friend or foe. They suffer a lot, and death is a salvation for them. From this state, as a main rule, there is no turning back. This is also the case here, because the fourth space marine who arrived on the planet was obsessed with this kind of possession. Astorath, by some mystical ability, always knows when and where another Blood Angels fall or will fall to the Black Rage. In that cases, Astorath travels to them with his spaceship to free his comrades, i.e., he kills the possessed Blood Angels. In the case of this short story, such a liquidation takes place. The fourth short story is The Test of Fate. This story deals with the Dark Angels. As I remember, this is a rather weak writing compared to the others in terms of excitement. Perhaps the story itself is not fully comprehensible and it's merely only an additional information to some larger plot. There is a bit of a political, intriguing thread at the very end without longer explanation. The short story's fraction is the Dark Angels are a rather mysterious chapter, or at least that's what is said about them. There are some things in their history that only the chapter and its inner circles know, such as the fact that their first legendary leader, Lionel Johnson, who is known to be dead, is actually alive in a stasis. At least he was still in stasis when the novel was published. In addition, the part of the chapter raised against the emperor 10,000 years ago. Incidentally, the focus of the novel is once again on the chaplains, specifically two chaplains, Raquel and Hadariel. Among them, Raquel is the higher in rank and Hadariel is a kind of novice chaplain. And if my interpretation is correct, he is facing a kind of final exam, and this is the story in which he will find out whether he passes or not. Hadariel belongs to the next generation of space marines, the primary space marines, who are bigger, stronger, faster, and more resilient than the regular Space Marines. In addition, he will be the first primary Space Marine who became a chaplain in the Dark Angel chapter. The creative plus in the writing is the deployment site of the Space Marines, which is a giant mobile mining machine, and the enemy force they wage war against, namely the Genestealer cult. It has been true for each of the novels so far that a different faction has always been brought in as the enemy of the Space Marines. And now it is also true. Though only half in part because the Gene Stealers are in fact a tyrannid infection that is mutating the population of the planet. In addition to the biological abnormalities, the Gene Stealer cult has a sectarian religious aspect. The members of the cult are mutating and becoming more and more different from a normal human being. They turn with worship, devotion, and dedication to the local leader of the cult, the patriarch, who can be considered to be a fully developed tyrannid. They are extremely convergent and supportive of each other and typically await the coming of a future that is favorable to them. This future usually described in some mystical terms such as the coming of the angels, but in reality this means the coming of the tyrannids who will absorb all living things on the planet, including the whole Genestealer cult. From there, the autonomous subjecthood of the members will be eliminated. So the Space Marine must purge the planet from this organization, and during this mission it will be determined whether Hadaria will pass the test or not. The fifth short story is The Darkling Hours, which focusing on the Imperial Guard. The Imperial Guard is the standard army of the Empire, who has trillions of billions soldiers. They are terribly many. Visually, they could be imagined in a very simplistic way, as the majority of them is similar to the today's US Army, only a slightly more modern version. Green helmets and breastplate, two-handed rifle, grey uniform. There are some pretty strong Soviet influences in their leadership principles. Mass attacks, strong disciplines, use of propaganda. The Imperial Guard is divided into different regiments on each planet. Amongst the regiments, there could be great differences in appearance and equipment. The protagonist of the short story is a commissar whose name is Severin Rain, a political officer within the Guard. These, commissar, these commissars are roughly equivalent to the commissars of the Old Red Army, as well as the chaplains of the Space Marines. Their duties are also to maintain moral, obedience, order, and discipline. They are best known for the typical action where a guardsman is shot in the head because of cowardice or disobedience. But there is no such thing in this short story. Compared to a simple commissar, Saverina Rain is humane, but she is sufficiently determined. On the planet where she and her squad are stationed, a rebellion has broke out. It happens all over the Imperium, and usually the chaos stands behind it. Chaos is not an adjective here, it's a noun. All the enemies of the Imperium, chaos is the most dangerous, the archenemy. This name is a summary name for a more complex concept. On the one hand, chaos means the world beyond the material world, here called the immaterium. On the other hand, it's also used to refer to the strange entities and life forms that live there. It also means a religious or spiritual direction, and all these things in a nutshell. In fact, the term of chaos resonates strongly with the concept of what we in the present world would call hell or the evil. And why would anyone want to join to the chaos? It could be explained as follows. In Warhammer, the main feature of the Empire of Man is that it's a brutal, religiously based dictatorship centered around the cult of the Emperor, who is to be worshipped as a god by ordinary citizens. The Empire is intolerant of all other religions except the Omnicia, the Machine God, all alien races, and all mutations. The Chaos interferes to this. The Chaos has its own pantheon with its own gods and their own so called life paths and carriers. Joining to the Chaos may seem to be an externally relevant and logical decision, but they are all a Faustian bargain. The person, the person who draws into the chaos gets something in return but has to pay a terrible price for it, such as he gets eternal life but in a constantly rotting, festering, and disgusting body, or he experiences extraordinary pleasures but never be satisfied with it, can't rest in it. Furthermore, in the process, the person sacrifices his or her very sanity, and thus ceases to be a healthy person. There is no turning back from the chaos. Whoever joins it remains forever on its side. As I said above, on the planet on which the novel is set, an uprising broke out in the form of a chaos sect called the Seekers. Our commissar and his squad must destroy a group of this rebellion. This small group, led by an extremely powerful Psyker. Psykers are the wizards of the Warhammer universe, or Jedis, if you prefer the Star Wars, who can use the power of the Immaterium to strike their opponents in various ways. This power means moving object, seeing into the future, mind reading, increasing physical strength, energy blast, and many other things. So Rain and his companion infiltrate to the lair of the Psyker, who is considered particularly powerful even among the Psykers. This witch mentally attacks the troops, unleashing delusions and illusions. This is his main power. For example, in front of Severina's eyes appears her dead sister, who was also commissar, to haunt her. Another soldier is reminded of a short story his mother told him as a child. In such a situation, the soldiers are really vulnerable because they are out of touch with the reality, with the outside world. But Severina managed to overcome the illusion and eventually shoot the Psyker. The atmosphere during the descent into the cave and the entrance is the writing's greatest strength. It's tense enough, mysterious, and exciting to wonder what might be waiting for us in the depths of the caves. This curiosity drives us forward, sentence by sentence, line by line, towards the final showdown. However, this success doesn't mean the defeat of the sect known as the Seekers. The war goes on, and this war is the subject of a separate book, The Honorbound, which also starring Severina Rain. The sixth story is The Lightning Run, which deals with the Imperial Air Force. This is the first story whose protagonist is a common soldier. She doesn't have any superpowers and she doesn't qualify as an officer, unlike the commissar in the previous story. She is a simple pilot and her name is Sal. Another peculiarity of the character is that he believes in the Emperor as a god and professes his belief in him. As I have already mentioned, everyone must be loyal to the Emperor, and the Imperial Church requires its citizens to regard him as a god, or else they will die. So, the citizens have no real choice. It's not an option for them. The Space Marines, however, have that option, and most of them don't believe in the Emperor as a god. Sal, however, is a firm believer in the Emperor and even in the machine spirit, which means that he believes that machines, in this case mainly war machines, have souls which can be enraged, tainted, and corrupted, etc. This is a peculiarity of the Warhammer world that because humanity is past its technological prime, there are technologies they no longer understand and they can't reproduce them. As a result of this, some people pray to the machines before they switch on them using incense, candles, litanies, etc. Moreover, dealing with technology itself is the privilege of a special organization who also form a religious cult. According to the story, Saul is waiting for a general along with the fellow pilot. The general needs to be taken urgently to an allied base because he has such an information that could influence the whole war campaign on the planet. On the planet, the Imperial Guard are fighting against the forces of chaos, but there are no supernatural beings in the ranks of the archenemy. It seems that a good part of the planet's population and military have simply joined to the Dark Gods, which in practice means that they have their own air force, tanks, and other war machines, etc. Sal's plane takes off and heads for its destination, but it's soon hit by an enemy anti-aircraft rocket and crashes. No one survives the disaster except Sal. The general is only alive long enough to hand him a ring, which is an essential aid to the military intelligence and reconnaissance, and Sal is determined to get into the target base. To get it to the target base. The general said that the fate of the entire campaign depends on it, and they have only few hours. Sal, however, doesn't become desperate and continues the mission. At this point, at this point in the novel, it was hard for me to imagine how she would do it, because she is alone in the jungle, hundreds of miles from his goal. But in the end, the way he did it seemed plausible. She approached the enemy airbase from which her plane was shot down. In this airbase, because the planet local army changed side, there are similar fighter aircrafts than in Saul's airbase, so she can run them. I will say no more about the story itself, but I would highlight the description of the enemy's chaos machine inside, which is quite horroristic, and the end of the story, which I think deserves a mention because it's not so much a classic happy ending as we are used to, but more of an ending that is fitting for the world of Warhammer and gives an insight into the working of the imperial propaganda machine. Actually, the end is a bit of a psychological and sensitive part of the story, which makes the character and the story itself very sympathetic and human. Since one of the characteristics of the Warhammer universe is its harness, we only get a small number of touching scans, especially from the view of a little man, but the dark contrast of the world is very strong to make these events particularly memorable. The next is the seventh story, The Missing in Action, which features a real big name in the form of the famous Inquisitor Eisenhorn. Incidentally, the protagonist of the world's very first Warhammer book was also an Inquisitor. This is a story about an investigation, and it's the only such story in this volume. Let us first look at who the Inquisitors are. In terms of numbers, they are a very small organization, but inversely they are endowed with almost overwhelming power, both as an organization and as individual inquisitors. They have the power to destroy entire planets and their populations and can order anyone to their service, but they themselves cannot be ordered except by their superiors within the Inquisition itself. In a sense, they are given almost unlimited power within the empire to achieve their goals. The organization is responsible only to the emperor himself, whether that may mean in practice, because the emperor has not been spoken for over 10,000 years. He vegetates in his throne between life and death. In the old times, only the very strong psychers could become inquisitors, but nowadays I think it has been changed. As I mentioned earlier, psychers are the magic users of the Warhammer world, but here they don't call it magic, they call it psychic energy. Or organizationally, the inquisitors are divided into different orders, grouped around a specific goal or task. There is also a certain separation among them around the ends justifies the means ideology. In this term, there could be radical and less radical inquisitors. Eisenhorn, the protagonist of the short story, about whom I have heard a lot, he is the subject of a famous trilogy, is unlike his professional colleagues, a rather human inquisitor. In the novel, he is visited by the governor of a planet or the minister of justice, I can't remember exactly which, but by a very high ranking person in the government. This person believes that there are traces of ritual murders on the planet. This would mean that the archenemy appeared on the planet. Once the facts are revealed to Eisenhorn, he too believes that the murders are not simple homicides, but indeed ritual killings. The, the deceased were mutilated quite badly. Eisenhorn decides to start an investigation. That's, I think, a good and exciting start of a story. Mysteries, brutal murders, and possibly a murderous cult. You don't need more than that for a good Warhammer story. So the characters look for details about the planet and whether chaos has been present there before, and if so, what evidence of it has occurred. But they don't really find any record about chaos influences. The strength of the short story is the sect, because here the sect, and this is a very big spoiler, is not a simple chaos cult. In essence, chaos, in the conventional way, is not even present in the cult. The cult, which is responsible for the murders, consists of former Astra Militarum soldiers, who, in their own way, remain fanatically loyal to the Empire and the Emperor himself, but when they left the army, they didn't leave the war behind. They actually brought the obsession of war back to their homeworld. There are some events that an ordinary person cannot process, and those who fight with chaos for many years pick up such traumas, and after it they see chaos and obsession where there is no such things. In essence, the former Astra Militarum members have become prisoners of delusions. They hallucinate that chaos has taken root on this planet. Eisenhorn is deeply saddened when discover the motives behind the murders, because the former ex-soldiers are still loyal to the Emperor in their own way. The center of the cult is the former recruitment building where the regiment members had to take their oaths. The end of the novel, Eisenhorn goes into this building and makes one last attempt to save the members. The cult members are singing an imperial anthem inside, which Eisenhorn joins in with sincerity and heart, and the story culminates in an emotional scan. But I will say no more about the end of the short story. What I really liked about the writing is that Eisenhorn is a very human, virtuous character, despite the fact, as I mentioned earlier, this is not typical of the people in his profession. He was cool headed, clever, and good hearted, all of which are necessary to ensure that a man of such great power doesn't become corrupt, rotten, and doesn't abuse his rights and opportunities. Now, let's look at the following story. The Crystal Cathedral. This story is about the Sister of Battle. The Sister of Battle are a private army of the Ecclesiarchy, the Imperial Church. As their name suggests, they are all women, for historical reasons. The Ecclesiarchy are, in my humble opinion, the sickest faction of the Empire, next to the Adeptus Mechanicus. They are extremely fanatical, dogmatical, widely intolerant, sin, penance, and punishment centered. Moreover, they are generally quiet, disproportionate, and cruel. The Sister of Battle have no supernatural powers, but they have an unshakable belief in the God Emperor. Fate works a bit differently in the world of Warhammer than it does in our world. Because the Immaterium exists in the Warhammer universe, which reacts to feelings, emotions, and therefore fate. So if someone wants something to happen and has a very strong belief in it, it's very likely to happen thanks to the power of the immaterial realm. Or at very least, something will happen that cannot be explained by conventional physics. For example, a battle sister's burnt hand is healed because she believes her faith in the Emperor can heal it. The protagonist of the short story is Sister Augusta and her team, who arrive as an honored guest for the reopening ceremony of a church which built of crystal. However, the celebration is interrupted by a huge monster that breaks into the church unexpectedly. Unfortunately, the sisters have no meaningful weaponry apart from their long daggers, but they take on the beast with death defying courage. That's pretty much the story, which ends with a little reflection on questions of fate. How could the God Emperor allow this sacred place to be desecrated by a Sano? Asks Augusta. His superior replies that this is actually a test of fate. The Emperor is testing their faith, and the question is whether they will stand the test. Generally speaking, on this subject, in theology, God, and I'm talking about the real God here, the real God doesn't really need tests, because he knows the results of the tests. God is omniscient, he absolutely must know the results of the tests. If he doesn't know, then he cannot be God. Trials can only show a person where he is in his faith, and through trials he can develop, God can develop him. In a sense, this is what can be said about trials in relation between trials and fate. According to the novel and the Warhammer universe in general, the Emperor must be convinced of fate or worthiness by trials, which is obviously an error in thinking if the Emperor is a real god. Of course, the discussion of serious topics such as the above is obviously not to be expected from a short length story like the Crystal Cathedral, which basically belonging to the light literature anyway. In any case, I thought I would say this topic in a few words and conclude this story. The next is The Speak as One. The Speak as One is a short story about the Adeptus Mechanicus, which, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the sickest factions in the Empire, next to the Ecclesiarchy and the Adeptus Sororitas. In appearance, they are more machines than men. They replace their organs and limbs with mechanic implants. It is essentially a religious organization of scientists, engineers, biologists, which worships technology, machines, and science. It's an integral part of the Warhammer 40k universe that the Empire is technologically advanced but far past its prime and has little or no ability to reproduce their most advanced technology. Furthermore, their attitude to the technology and technological advances are highly narrow-minded. On the one hand, in principle, only the Mechanicus can deal with all kinds of technology and science in the Empire. On the other hand, they believe that technology can only be rediscovered, not created. In a sense, they want to reach the technology of the Empire's golden age by rediscovery, not by real self-development. So anyone who develops is a heretic in their eyes. They also have a specialty that their religion is the only allowed religion beside the cult of the emperor. Their god is called Omnicia, or in other words, the machine god. They believe that every machine has a machine spirit inside it. So machines have a kind of soul which can be disturbed, and in this case, its need to be calmed down. The story is set on a space station owned by the Inquisition. They received a request from a renegade member of the Adeptus Mechanicus. According to the request, the Inquisitor who ruled the station must hand over a prisoner to an immediately arriving envoy. This request leads to a jurisdictional dispute among the leaders of the space station. The envoy is sent by a person named Belisarius Kroll, let's call him a tech priest now, who has the support of Robert Guilliman, the protector and lord commander of the Imperium. Perhaps I think there is his signature or some sort of endorsement on the request too. Robert Guilliman, without going into more detail about him now, is both the head of the Ultramarine chapter, who appears in the first short story, and leader of the whole Imperium. Only the Emperor himself is above him. So we're talking about a person with quiet, unassailable authority, and Crow has his backing because Crow was the scientist who developed the next generation of space marines, the primary space marines. At the beginning of the short story, this strain leads to a sort of legal question because the Inquisitor who is in command is quite arrogant and doesn't want to simply grant the request. Among his advisors, the opinions are divided. According to the tech priest working alongside the Inquisitor, Belisarius Kroll is a heretic from the side of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who violates the principles of the Mechanicus with his actions and only seemingly keep them. The Inquisitor's other advisor, however, points out that they cannot ignore the weight of Lord Guilliman, whose authority delegated from the Emperor himself and now essentially the head of the Empire. So, he has an ultimate authority and he supports Kroll. But the Inquisitor thinks that Guilliman, only the main military leader of the Imperium, and the Inquisition owes loyalty only to the Emperor himself. According to him, the conversation between the Emperor and Guilliman is disputable because only they were there, nobody else. In addition, probably the Emperor can't talk because he is locked in his throne prophecies for 10,000 years and only a few can enter to his throne room. So, he doesn't believe that this kind of authority was told. In the light of this, he decides that he doesn't want to give up his precious prisoner. Crow's delegate counts for this, and he prepared with a plan B, which consists of a diverse attack and an operation by a special agent in the space station. This agent is a space marine with psychic power. With psychic power. Henceforward, we follow the step of this agent. And the spoiler is coming. There are few prisoners in the space station, and the house doesn't mention exactly which one they are talking about. So, maybe they speak about different persons. But I don't want to say any more about this story. Let's move on to the next one. The next one is Where's, Where There's the Warp, There's a Way. This short story is the funniest of all, and if this is the case, then this writing cannot be about any other than orcs. Although they don't mean to be funny, they are funny because they think their statements are logically correct. For example, first of all, they use slang which is inherently humorous, and they wonder why people build temples with such high interiors, and they think the likely answer is because toads have to fly to their god and the height is needed for the proper way of flying. Furthermore, they invent clever tricks to fool their opponents. The orcs in the world of Warhammer are pretty much the standard fantasy orcs. That means they are big, stupid, violent, and cruel. Given that they are quite unintelligent, one might wonder how this race is even capable of space travel. As I mentioned earlier, in the 40k universe, the nature of belief is a bit different than in our world. The orcs are blessed with a lot of psi power without even knowing it, meaning that if enough orcs believe that something will work, it will work. It drives their technology, which otherwise shouldn't have to work within the rules of conventional physics. Their fighters, planes, buildings, spaceships are made of junk, rubbish, and garbage. Another characteristic of the orcs is that they are organized by strength, so a leader can only be the strongest amongst them. In the short story, the orcs are planning to attack an Adeptus Mechanicus fleet in order to obtain a device that will make navigating in warp easier. The protagonist of the novel is Ufthak, who takes second place in this team below the leader. The orcs manage to cross the AdMech ship, and the fighting in the corridors begins. Meanwhile, we see the view of Ufthak, who laments that AdMech soldiers are not willing to engage them in a fair hand-to-hand combat, but mostly just want to attack them from a distance. He also mentions that humans are strange to him in many ways, as they like to shout various things during battle, including the divinity of their emperor. However, he notes with some curiosity that once met humans wearing spiked armor who shouted that the emperor was a corpse. This is a little confusing for him. Nevertheless, they make pretty good progress towards the interior of the AdMech ship, overcoming all resistance until they encounter a Castellan robot. At least the description suggests that they encounter this type of robot and they simply cannot get past. During the fight, the leader of the team also falls, opening up the opportunity for Ufthak to ascend and take his place. From here, we can follow the cunning ploys to defeat the war machine and see if Ufthak can consolidate his position at the head of his team. The short story is definitely a breath of fresh air with its humor compared to the rest of the writing. For me, it was a pleasant disappointment as I have no sympathy for orcs in this universe. However, their simplicity of thought and casual view of the world made them likable in this novella. Sometimes one of them has a bit of more wisdom than the other, although obviously they always like to hit first and ask questions later. Now the following short story is the redemption on Dila. This story takes us to the realm of the Tau Empire. The Tau are a largely humanoid, blue-skinned, young race. They are physiologically a little weaker than an average human, but in return, they have very advanced technology. They are also special in that, unlike other species in the Warhammer universe, they haven't yet reached the peak of their technology and they are in process of expanding. The most distinctive feature of the species, however, is its principle of social organization. A philosophy permits the Tao, which they call the greater good. This affects every aspect of their lives. Their whole society is built on this approach. They all serve it. In my understanding, the greater good means to strive for the moral good basically. And when several things that seem to be good come into collision, the person should balance the values and choose the one that is considered to be greater, more valuable, or cause the less disadvantage to others in the given situation. Of course, this is not a bad principle. In fact, we use it ourselves in our daily lives, and practically the common sense also dictates it. The difficulty arises when the two conflicting values have very similar weight and one just slightly, just with a line, exceeds the other. During this consideration, the person should be as objective as possible, although sometimes it's really hard. Some say it's almost impossible. Another question is how much the other value should be violated, how much it should be limited. Obviously, a certain proportionality must be strove, but these are very difficult questions. See, for example, the questions of sin and punishment. What is the weight of the sin and what punishment should go with it? What circumstances should count in such cases? How much, if at all, should sincere repentance count? Or whether there is any reason in any punishment at all if the person has sincerely repented of his deed and has been cleansed, so to speak, in the bath of his conscience. Going back a little bit more specifically to the Tao, from their perspective, is it right to kill? If so, to what extent, if one doesn't want to join to their philosophy? According to their principle, there is no individualism among the Tao, only the collective which matters. There is no reckless self-sacrificing heroism, because the people need you. You must serve the Tao Empire. The Tao, furthermore, is divided into castes. There are separate scientists, leaders, engineers, and so on. The main character of this novel is Shakantas, a mythical warrior, revered as a hero by the Tao. He was the master of none other than Farsight himself. Supposedly, Shakantas gave him the Farsight name. Of course, Farsight means something only to those who know Warhammer 40k for a longer time. He is a very famous, if not the most famous Tau character. However, he is considered as a traitor by the Tau Empire, and the Tau disavowed him. Even Farsight himself doesn't consider himself as a part of the Tau Empire. Going back to Shakantas, he has been practically a living statue for centuries due to a stasis field. He is seen or can be found in a training facility frozen into eternity while he is fighting a deadly battle with a space marine, chapter master. By the way, the stasis field was activated by the space marine chapter master during their battle. Unfortunately, the Tau couldn't figure out how this kind of technology worked and they were unable to free Sakantas. Every year, he and his opponent are presented as an example to the young Tau warrior classes of the training center. But one day something happens that causes the disappearance of the stasis field, and the two statues wake up to pick up the fight where they left off. Unfortunately, the weapon systems of Shakanta's battle armor have failed during the time they were frozen, and he is unable to fight with the chapter master. The chapter master is rather little in close combat, although he has a powerful bolter mounted on his left arm. Anyway, the bolter is the iconic weapon of the Space Marines. Shakantas is indignant at his non-functioning weapon systems, and he is eventually forced to take a flight. The chapter master pursues him in frenzy, destroying everything in his path. Considering that this is a recreating world, there are no regular infantry on the planet, only the cadets. So the chapter master goes through everybody like a bulldozer. Shakantas tries to radio for help, but because he is using frequencies that have not been used by the Tau for hundreds of years, he cannot reach anyone. However, some cadets who are stationed there come to his aid, and his old comrade Farsight checks in on the radio because Farsight remembers the radio coordinates he and his friend Shakantas used together. Shakantas and the cadets head to a military museum where they can get some battle suits which still in working condition. Here, Shakantas rushes through the exhibits, and during this he is confronted with the passage of time and the fact that Tau have dedicated a special panel for Farsight as a traitor. He is widely shocked and confused by this. However, he has more important things to think about at the moment because he is being pursued by the chapter master. Finally, the main confrontation happens in the museum with Farsight's helpful advices. I think it was an interesting short story which showed the things from the Tau's point of view, and in their perspective, the human race is portrayed as a barbaric, aggressive empire. However, an interesting quote is said about the Tau by the chapter master, which sounds something like this: "You don't care how many beings you kill for the greater good." From his perspective, the Tau are obviously not better than humans. The next short story is about the Eldars. Its name, the Void Crossed. The Eldars actually space elves in the 40k universe. Once they ruled a vast realm, now they become a small nation who lives on craft worlds which are actually mass spaceships that travel across the stars. Their present civilization is only a fragment compared to the past. They are greatly blessed by psychic power, but they are on the edge of extinction. They are far outnumbered and desperately fight for their survival. Thanks to their special technology, the Webgate system, they don't have to travel across the immaterial world. It's much more safer way of traveling because there are no demonic incursion and other anomalies. The Eldars, like many other fantasy universes, have Dark Brothers. They are the Dark Eldars. The Dark Eldars have only one city, which isn't in the real space, but in the web-based system. Of course, they are also active in the real space. The Dark Eldars are a sadistic, deceitful version of the original Eldar race. Their society is poisoned by treachery, greed for power, obsession, and hedonism. The Void Cross short story is a romantic tale, but in Warhammer 40k style, which means it won't end happily. We see the events from the Dark Eldar's point of view, although we won't get deeply into their viewpoint. The main characters, as I found out, it's not a naturally born Dark Eldar, but a Craftworld Eldar who joined to the Dark Eldars because he found his goals and his fulfillment there. He was in love with a Craftworld Eldar woman who also joined to the Dark Eldars. However, this relationship broke when their opinion about meaning of life was changed. And as happens so often, former love has turned to hatred. After the breakup, the man stayed amongst the Dark Eldars, and the woman went to the Craftworld Eldars. They rose to higher and higher positions. According to the story, they met again in a battle for a webway gate, each intent on killing the other. We witnessed this cruel fight where the two characters and their company attacked each other, and the massacre and also the duel between the characters began. In this short story, we get information about the Dark Eldars rather than the normal Craftworld Eldars. Although they have the dark term in their name, they don't attach to the chaos. In fact, there is a chaos deity who is the archenemy of the Eldars and therefore of the Dark Eldar race. And so, if they want to do good for themselves, they don't really collaborate with the chaos. Especially the Dark Eldars engage in certain immoral and reprehensible activities precisely to keep chaos, or more precisely, that one particular deity away from themselves and their souls. The short story itself is a description of a duel between the former lovers. The two sides are actually roughly equal in strength and both command formidable forces and power in the fight. They don't care about escape or survival because they want to kill the other more than stay alive. Whether they will survive or which one will survive, I won't tell it for you. I keep it as a secret. Let's skip to the next story, the light of the crystal sun. Considering to the subject, this is the most special writing in the tome, or rather it could be because it tells about the Chaos faction. According to my opinion, the Chaos is not only set to bad, but it's really evil indeed, at least in its goals. But it's only my personal opinion and interpretation. In my point of view, who gets in connection with the chaos, if he survives it at all, his life becomes more miserable than before. That's true even oneself doesn't know or see it. Usually the latter used to happens. Beside, I know that the main explanation of chaos rather highlights not its evilness but its chaotic manifestation, and his explanation mentions some honorable attribution like bravery, thirst for knowledge, the circulation of life and death, and so on. Personally, I was really curious who got the chance to act for the Chaos. Maybe the Chaos Space Marines, the Demons, or a Chaos Scout. But eventually, an iconic figure, Fabius Bile, got the opportunity. He is a kind of Victor Frankenstein in the Warhammer universe. Long time ago, he was a space marine medical officer, an apothecary, but now his activities can't match the conventional medicine processes. Rather, presently, he is a sadistic scholar. Fabius is separated from the other faction of Chaos and he walks on his own way. In the writing, we could glance a little bit into his motivations. Behind his diabolic experiments basically stand two factors. On the one hand, he has a deadly disease which causes him terrible suffering, and on the other hand, he would like to save humanity, but this latter motivation turns out from dropped words. Probably he wants to give them eternal life without the existence of diseases. Fabius' appearance is really horrific. He has highly rare long grey hair, sickly pale skin, cold cruel eyes, All kinds of medical equipment are implanted on his power armor, and the most horrible is that he wears a dress made of stitched human skins. Also deserves a mention that his creatures treat him religious respect and call him Jim Father. In this short story, we look at into an experiment during which he researches the eternal life. The elder race uses soul stone in which somehow they could store the consciousness of their ancestors for eternity. Bai wants to reveal the secrets of this technology. The world of the soul stones is a sort of spiritual universe. Fabius uses humans gifted with psychic abilities to discover the requiring informations. But the soul stones don't want to expose their secrets, they resist and kill the psychers. Finally, Fabius intended a desperate step. He thinks he has enough iron will to step into the mighty world of soul stones and gets their knowledge. It's true that Fabius is not a psyker, but with some chemicals he can give himself temporarily psyker abilities. So the crossing happens, and Fabius must face off the ruling power of this mythical world. That's all I wanted to tell about this story. This short story is carried on by Fabius's character and his background. It's good to read about Bai because he is a well-known person on the side of chaos, although he is a renegade inside this faction. But beside this, it would have been very good if we get a more hardcore chaos short story with chaos space marines or demons which tells about the corruption, foulness and brutality that belong to the true chaos. The next short story is about the Necrons and its title is War in the Museum. More precisely, the main character is one particular Necron who is atypical compared to the other Necrons because he is not part of the Necron Empire. He is Trazin the Infinite, a separate entity. Of course, he is also insensitive, cold, and logical like any other Necrons, but he is really different in some aspects. The most important thing, Trazin does a really special hobby, namely the collecting. But he doesn't collect any ordinary things like other collector. He collects beings and he holds them artificial immobility like statues with a stasis. In his museum, such topics appear in exhibitions like wars between the Tyranids and the Imperium. Trazin recorded the opponents in a moment of their battle. Across the exhibitions, Trazin places loudspeakers which serves as guidance. Back to the Necron race, millennia ago, the Necrons ruled the galaxy after they won a great war against the ancestors. But today they are only shadow of their former self who want to restore their original identity. In this short story, we don't know much about the Necrons or the Necron Empire. We see Trazin, who is working with the allocation of a special Tyranid being when some trouble happens. Movements detected in some parts of the museum. Trazin hurries there to solve the problem, but instead solving the problem, he simply dies. Luckily, Trazin not a simple Necron, so her consciousness wakes up again in another prepared body, then he goes after the wandered monster again. But it kills her once more. The trouble seems bigger than it looks like firstly. Because of something technical problem, Trazin can't call her Necron legions, so he can't end this conflict by overpower. Therefore, he decides to resurrect some objects in the exhibitions, or in this case, they are not objects but beings. They are a renegade tech priest and two Adeptus Sororitas warriors. Trazin uses mind control scarabs to rule the two battle sisters. During this time, it comes out that the Tyranids woke up and they permanently wake up and causing the problem. Because of the outnumber and because of this is not seem to be an isolated but a system level problem, Trazin decides to escape to a deeply central part of the museum where they find what causes this whole thing. That's all about the story itself. For me, the most interesting character was the renegade tech priest who was almost a friendly relationship with Trazin. In this short story, it was hard to identify myself with anybody, and the hidden enemy didn't seem to me so fearsome, but it was a good feature that somebody stand in the background and move the strings because you could feel that this conflict is a part of a bigger thing, a bigger fight. I personally read rather a story with the Silent King because after all, he is the true leader of the Necron nation, or at least over a notable number of the Necrons, or if it's not him, then someone who present the Necron perspective, viewpoint, thinking in a more authentic way than an outsider. In this short story, we don't get anything from the Necrons' view about their place in the universe, because Trazin, just like Fabius Bile, is an exemption character among their faction. Although, at the end of the story, Trazin did a typical malicious Necron thing, and eventually we could say that the Necron faction also received a separate short story. The next short story is The Headhunted, which is about the Death Watch. The Death Watch is a special Space Marine chapter because the other Space Marine chapters delegate their best to the Death Watch, which is specialized for fighting against aliens like orcs, eldars, necrons, tyranids, and so on. The Death Watch is also uncommon in their loyalty because they are devoted to an inquisitorial order. Essentially, the Death Watch is the private army of this order. It's a great honor if a Space Marine chapter could delegate a member to the Death Watch. This short story tells about a commando action carried out by a specialized Death Watch unit, a kill team, in an Orc spaceship. According to their commission, they have to execute a dangerous being during a limited period of time. Essentially, the reader is driven by the curiosity of what awaits the kill team at the end of their mission. Did the orcs find anything ancient? What can it be? What kind of creature? Maybe a demon? The protagonist is the leader of the kill team, who is a librarian, which means in the Space Marine ranks that he is such a warrior who can use psychic power. From his perspective, we get some interesting descriptions of the warp and how it works in the psyker's mind, about the temptation they must face in order to preserve their personality, the integrity of their soul, and to neutralize demonic influences. If they surrender too much to the power of the immaterial world, the creatures within it will take control of them. They may see horrible images and hear frightening sounds. This kind of situation is especially difficult when you need the might of the warp not for authority but for survival. In this case, staying alive requires you to draw on largely the power of the warp, but in such cases you have to endure significantly greater temptations. The main character balances on the narrow path of his trial. The final battle of the short story is epic enough for this small tale. The final short story is about the guardians of the Emperor, the Custodes, who are one of, if not the toughest faces in the book. The short story's title is Duty unto Death. The Custodes are the direct protectors of the Emperor himself, who is the supreme leader of the Imperium. They wear gold armor, and each one of them are equivalent with 100 space marines. So, they are absolutely the top amongst the Imperium armies. There's a separate story about why and by whom it was decided that this elite unit should take a direct part in the war and in the frontline fighting, but I wouldn't go into it now. Let it be enough that originally the Custodes were on the Terra with the Emperor. In this novel, only 6 of them arrive on a planet to collect a particularly important artifact. They accomplish this mission, but then their fleet, which is in orbit around the planet, is destroyed by the Tyranids, who have sensed that organic life is nearby. Given that the Custodes no longer have spaceships, they have no way to escape and leave the planet. Then the Tyranids start to dropping out of the sky. So the situation of the Custodes is desperate enough. The novel is essentially a final battle in which the 6 warriors fight the endless hordes of Tyranids to protect the artifact they have come. The origin and the nature of this object remains hidden until the end of the novel. The writing keeps the reader curious in 2 aspects. The first is to wonder what the precious thing is that the Custodes have come for this planet. It would have given itself that this particular artifact was a relic in connection with the Emperor. After all, what else would the Custodes risk his life for if not for something which is more important in his worldview than his life? The second question is whether any of them can survive somehow the battle. Obviously, the reader wants their survival because he sympathizes with the dutiful, brave and golden warriors. At the end of the story, the worth of the Custodes warriors absolutely weigh in. And last, we finish the tome. Finally, my overall opinion about the anthology is very good. It was very enjoyable, super value for money. Its great strength in the structure itself. This book gives you a very varied reading experience because almost all the factions are included. Mostly, the book was almost impossible to put down. I only felt once or twice that the short stories were boring. For example, when I read the novels about the Space Wolves or the Dark Angels. All in all, anyone who buys it gets very exciting stories for their money. I recommend it for beginners and advanced Warhammer readers alike, and I would like make it a must for the Black Library itself to publish start here volumes about these themes and quality. The Black Library, by the way, has a number of similar anthologies organized around different themes, for example, horror, second founded space marine, Tau, and so on. There are dozens of them. In addition to Nexus, they also have a so-called Start Here anthology release, which title is Crusade. It also has a similar structure to Nexus, but it's a bit thinner, has a few less factions, no summaries at the beginning of the novels, and only one book recommendation at the end of the stories, not 2. I am finished reading it, and I intend to work on it in the next video. I'm a bit slow, so the next video will be a long time coming, but I will try my best. I wish you all a good day. I was Attila, and this was the Warhammer Books channel.